This is my perfect pie crust recipe. You want to start by making sure you have all the proper ingredients. You want to make sure you have your salt, your flour, your shortening, your eggs, your vinegar, your water, and your proper utensils to make the recipe. I also add a dash of cinnamon just to add flavor. You want to make sure every measurement of flour is precise, otherwise it could cause the recipe to get too dry. Once you've got your 2 cups of flour, or in my case 4 cups of flour, you want to add your salt. Now, I now have my salt in the bowl. The next step is to cut in your room temperature Crisco or lard, whichever you're choosing to use. I use Crisco because it's an all vegetable shortening, and I don't have to worry about using it for people who are vegetarians. Now the first starting point is I always recommend to mix together the mixture. The salt will otherwise sit on top and it will not actually cut together properly. I've now put the Crisco in the bowl. I pre-cut my Crisco just to make sure that it was easier for me to put it into my mixture. Now, not all Crisco bricks are evenly shaped. I always recommend measuring by the Crisco guideline here. Before you start cutting the Crisco into the flour mixture, you want to make sure your cutter is clean. If you do not have a cutter, you can always use 2 knives. I'll demonstrate how each one looks. This is for all you using the cutter. You want to make sure you get nice even cuts with the pastry, and you want to continue blending. When cutting with 2 knives, you want to make sure you hold them like you're cutting a piece of meat. With your fork here, your knife here, and you cut like this. So you want to make sure that everything comes out nice and evenly cut. Now it can take a while to actually get the process of cutting when it comes down to 2 knives. That's why I always recommend buying a cutter, as it will help you a lot later down the road. Now that you've started cutting, you want to make sure that the pieces of shortening resemble pea-like shapes. You also want to make sure that you get down to the bottom of the bowl. This is what your mixture should resemble when it's done. Small pea-like little shapes. The next step of the recipe calls for us to add our eggs, our vinegar, and our water. Now, because I'm making a double recipe, I added my 2 eggs. Now, I don't tend to beat them with a whisk. I beat them with a fork just because I find it's easier and there's less mess to clean up. So I add my vinegar to the eggs, which are 2 tablespoons. I add my 4 tablespoons of water because, again, I'm making a double recipe. And then I find my fork and I beat the mixture together. This can just be like making scrambled eggs or French toast. For the next step, we take our beaten mixture of egg, water, and vinegar and pour it evenly over our mixture of shortening and flour and salt. Now, if you miss a couple areas, that's okay. It's not going to hurt the recipe that much. Now you take your fork, which you were blending earlier, your mixture together, and you just start mixing it together. This is what your mixture should look like. You want to make sure that it's mixed just until everything is moist. If your mixture does end up clumping together and creating balls, that's okay. It may be a little bit moist. When you end up rolling it out in the end, you'll use a little bit more flour just to make sure it's not as moist. If it's too dry, what you want to do is you want to add a little bit more water just to make sure that you don't have so much flour in the bottom of the pan. Now you want to take your recipe and you want to split it into 2 balls. This is what your final results will look like. What I do is I push down on my balls to make them flat so it's easier for chilling. The main reason why you want to chill your dough is you want to make sure that it's easier for you to roll out. If it's left in a warm condition, it'll be sticky. Now I put it in the freezer just because I have 2 larger dough balls here. Just remove my pie crust from the freezer. You should give it about 15 minutes just to make sure it gets really cold. I've already laid out my rolling pin and my rolling board, as I do have granite tile countertops and everything gets stuck in the grooves of them. So as you can see, I have my pie crust here. I'm rolling it on the board and coating it into flour. What this will do is it'll help me roll it out better. And then I just also want to spread out some more flour when I'm rolling it out. As you can see, I just floured my rolling pin. This is to make sure that none of the dough sticks. So I start rolling out my dough and I make sure that I'm doing a nice and even job. Now before I get it really flat, I want to flip it over again. Make sure I spread some more flour on the board. Make sure I get a little bit more flour on my rolling pin. Now if you're wondering what kind of rolling pin you need to use, you don't have to worry. You could use wood, you could use granite, or you could use any other variable source for a rolling pin. I know they have many different kinds out there nowadays, and I find it just varies on what you prefer to use. Now once your dough starts to get a little bit thinner, I just turn it once more just to give it that even rolling. Otherwise, you could end up with a pie crust that's too thin in one area and not very thin. You want to make sure you're getting it into a more round kind of shape. It doesn't matter if it's exactly the shape of the pie pan, because you always know that you can cut the edges and make sure that it fits in the pie pan. And as you can see, my rolling pin again is starting to stick, so I'll add some more flour. Now if you're wondering the amount of flour you should use, I don't actually have a set amount. I just fill up my 1 cup with some flour, and then I just start using it from there. You want to make sure you don't use too much, otherwise your dough will get a little bit dry. Now you can see it looks like my dough is a nice thin dough. You want to about have it a little less than a centimeter. You don't want it too thick. As you can see, my edges are quite thick. Now what I do to put the pie dough into the rolling pin, or into the pan, is I roll it gently on my rolling pin. This way it makes it easier for me to actually put it in there. So I've got my pie pan right here. I lift up the rolling pin gently, and then I just roll it back onto the pan. Now once you've done that, you just adjust. So you lift up the sides just to make sure that it fits all in the pan. Now this is a perfect example over here. I've got a little bit of a tear, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some pie crust that I pulled off my rolling pin earlier and just kind of add it in there and smooth it out. If you're making a lemon meringue pie or something where you need to bake it prior and then you add a liquid to it, you want to make sure that you have these holes filled just in case, because the liquid will end up going into the pie plate as you're baking. Now is when I tend to add some of my cinnamon. I find that, it gives that extra little bit of flavor, and you don't usually have to worry about how much you put in there because you can always spread it around with your fingers. I don't suggest putting too much depending on the pie that you're making. If you're making an apple pie, which I will be making for my second pie, it's going to add that extra little bit of flavor which you're going to love with the pie. Now when it's coming to taking off the edges, I know lots of people have different ways of doing this. You could use a knife to take them off by just cutting around the side of the pie plate. Now you'll need to be very gentle, and you'll probably want to use a butter knife. I'm using a sharp knife because I ran out of butter knives. So you just want to cut it off around the sides and make sure that you have enough so that you can pinch up the dough to make an edge. Now if you're like me and you're too lazy to use a knife, or you're afraid you're going to cut yourself, you can just start ripping the dough. Now what you do is you just roll it up underneath. This is actually my grandma's technique, and then you just pinch. So roll up underneath and pinch. Roll up underneath and pinch. Now there are many different techniques to making pie crust. You can do many different things to pinch the edges. So as you can see, my pie crust is finally done. Now I just want to make sure that there's no holes or anything like that I should touch up. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to touch up this one over here that I touched up earlier. I just want to make sure, as this is going to be a lemon meringue pie, that none of the liquid is going to leak into the bottom. Now if you're wondering what to do when you actually put the lemon meringue pie in the oven and you don't have any pie weight, so here's my parchment paper. I laid it out. There's quite a bit there. Some of you are going to wonder why parchment paper and why not wax paper. Wax paper can burn, whereas parchment paper is made for ovens, so it's not going to burn as bad. It'll just brown. So now I'm going to put my pasta in. So there's my pasta in there. I have used it before, that's why you can see the little burnt parts. Now what you can do is you could also use beans as well. However, you want to always make sure that you put it on the parchment paper because the flavor can leach into the actual crust itself. And you can see I've got a lot of stuff hanging off the side. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut that all off. Okay, so I've got it all prepared. Now I've got my oven set for 390. You can set it for anywhere between about 375 and 400 to cook the pie crust. I want it to cook a little bit faster just so I can have more time to let it cool down, as I'm going to be making some lemon meringue pie. There's one major problem with trying to check to see if your pie is done. You cannot always tell by lifting up the edges to see if your pie is actually cooking. So what you want to do is you always want to keep an eye on the time. The sides of the pie crust have started to brown a lot, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out the noodles that are in there, and then I'm just going to put it back in there for a couple minutes. So this is what the pie crust looks like now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in there for about 5 to 10 more minutes, and then I'm going to check on it. My pie crust is now done.